Murder on the Christmas Dog Walk, a Miss Marple mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple mystery. I am Jane, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Snow. The morning after the Christmas dog walk dawned pale and silent over Little Bramble. The snowfall that had delighted the children yesterday now lay heavy and still, softening the rooftops and muffling the sounds of the waking village. Only the distant toll of the church bell and the steady crunch of the constable's boots broke the calm. Behind the curtains of every cottage, heads bent close together, voices low, each whispering the same uneasy question. How could such a thing happen here? Miss Marple sat near the hearth at her niece Maggie's cottage, a porcelain cup warming her hands. The tea smelled faintly of bergamot and comfort, yet the mood in the room was anything but restful. Maggie's cheeks were pale as she retold what had happened. She'd been among the walkers last night, her terrier Daisy trotting happily along the snowy lane until the barking began. The image of the man beneath the holly still haunted her, his scarf bright against the white, his face oddly peaceful in the lantern light. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her eyes gentle but thoughtful. Every so often she nodded, as though storing away each detail like a note in a ledger. Such a dreadful business, Maggie sighed, stirring her tea, though she had long since added sugar. And on Christmas Eve of all nights. Outside, a milk cart creaked past the window. The driver, raising his cap to the constable, who stood speaking with Mrs. Pennington at her gate. Mrs. Pennington, despite the hour, was already wrapped in her thick shawl and full of opinions. She claimed she'd seen the poor man, Martin Ellis, walking along the green late last night, with someone beside him. She couldn't say who exactly. A tall figure, she told the constable. Could have been a man, could have been a woman. Hard to tell with all that snow coming down. In a village as small as Little Bramble, mystery spread like smoke through a chimney. By the time the baker's boy finished his morning round, half the cottages knew that Martin Ellis, recently arrived, quiet, polite, was now the centre of the most serious conversation in years. Rumours twined like ivy. Some said he was a writer who'd kept strange hours. Others claimed he'd been seen near the post office after dark, waiting for letters that never came. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime learning that people reveal themselves in what they notice, simply asked her niece, was anyone missing from the walk? Maggie frowned. No one I can think of, though Clara Devine did leave early, said her dog was tired. But that was long before it happened. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the small pair of boots drying near the fire, snow still melting from their soles. Funny thing about snow, she said quietly. It keeps secrets very poorly. Footprints tell all sorts of tales if one knows how to listen. Outside, the constable bent to study the ground near the green, but the fresh fall had covered everything anew. The prints from the previous night were nearly gone, blurred, indistinct. Yet one pattern remained, a set of small paw marks leading toward the hedgerow, stopping suddenly near where the body had been found. Beyond that, nothing. It was as though the man had vanished into the snow itself. As Maggie fetched another pot of tea, the door rattled gently in its frame. The wind carried a faint tune from the church square where carolers had sung only hours ago. How quickly joy could turn to silence, Miss Marple thought. She took another sip, eyes glinting with quiet curiosity. In Little Bramble everyone knew everyone, or believed they did. But sometimes the kindest faces hid the oldest stories. The snow remembers everything, she murmured to herself, watching a single flake drift past the window-pane, except the truth. The snow still clung to the hedges along the green when Miss Marple arrived at the scene later that morning. Inspector Cray stood with his collar turned up, a tall figure framed by the ghostly breath of the cold air. The holly bush beneath which the body had been found looked strangely innocent in daylight, its leaves sparkling with frost, its red berries gleaming like drops of blood against white. Yet, beneath that beauty, the earth was disturbed, and a dark patch of melted snow marked where tragedy had melted its way through the night. "Morning, Miss Marple," Cray greeted, his tone respectful but brisk. "Quite the Christmas surprise we've had." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild. "Indeed, Inspector. Not quite the sort of gift one expects beneath the holly." He managed a brief smile, then gestured toward the evidence marker. "The victim's name is Martin Ellis, lodged at the old mill house. No sign of robbery or... Just this." He pointed to the red scarf still coiled near the body, its edges stiff with frost. "Knotted oddly, don't you think?" Miss Marple bent closer, careful not to disturb the snow. "Yes," she murmured. "Too neat for panic. Whoever tied it must have done so calmly, or fondly." The knot was a simple loop, turned back on itself, something that might have been adjusted rather than forced. She looked up at Cray. "Was this his own scarf?" Cray shrugged. "Can't say yet. His landlady mentioned he owned one like it. Perhaps an accident, then. He might have fallen." Miss Marple's eyes drifted across the ground. "With his scarf conveniently tightened after the fall?" she said softly. The inspector said nothing. A light wind stirred the branches, shaking loose a flurry of snowflakes that caught the morning sun. Miss Marple moved slowly, her gaze wandering toward a patch of disturbed snow a few yards away. Something glinted faintly beneath it. She knelt, carefully, so as not to startle the constable hovering nearby, and brushed aside a layer of frost. Out came a small tin, round and pale blue, its paint chipped but charming. The label was nearly gone, yet she could just make out the faded outline of a dog and the words, "Good boy." "Curious," she said, holding it up. "Dog biscuits, I imagine. And yet not a single dog has been here since the discovery." Cray frowned. "Probably dropped by one of the walkers." "Doesn't seem relevant." Miss Marple turned the tin in her gloved hand. A faint, hand-painted detail caught her eye, a tiny flower near the rim, not part of any factory design. "Someone took care to decorate it," she said quietly. "That's not something easily replaced." When she shook it lightly, it gave no rattle. Empty. Cray waved toward his constable. "Bag it if you must, but I doubt it's anything." His tone had softened slightly. "You see mysteries where I see snow, Miss Marple?" "Perhaps," she replied with a gentle smile. "But snow can cover more than footprints, Inspector." "Sometimes it hides intent." He chuckled and turned back to his notes. Miss Marple lingered, watching how the morning light stretched across the ground. Her gaze returned to the holly bush. The scene had been tidied, the body taken away, but the stillness carried a kind of echo, as though something unsaid hovered in the cold air. She glanced again at the tin, then slipped the detached lid carefully into her pocket, the painted flower catching a final glint of sunlight. As she walked back toward the lane, her boots left neat impressions in the fresh snow. Behind her, the wind began to rise, smoothing over every trace. Yet one thought lingered in her mind like a whisper. Sometimes what's buried in snow refuses to stay hidden. Chapter 2. Tracks and Tales. By late afternoon, the sun had thinned into a pale disk above Little Bramble, its weak light glancing off the fields in sheets of silver. The constables were already out on the green, heads bent low, tracing the lines of footprints before the next snowfall erased them entirely. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the lane beside Inspector Cray, her scarf fluttering lightly in the wind. From here, the whole village seemed suspended between silence and breath, a picture-perfect winter's day hiding something deeply untidy beneath its calm. Cray was pointing toward a cluster of marks in the snow. "These prints start near the green," he said, "then head toward the riverbank. But the odd thing is, they loop back again. Whoever made them walked in circles." Miss Marple's eyes followed the path. The tracks were uneven, some sunken, others lightly dusted. "Not circles, Inspector," she said softly. "More like hesitation." "Someone changed their mind," he grunted, unimpressed. "All lost their way." "In this weather, even I might." A constable approached, breath steaming. "Beg pardon, sir." "There's a boy asking for you. Says he saw something last night." The boy was small, red-cheeked, clutching his cap in nervous hands. "It was near the river," he stammered.
"I couldn't sleep, see, so I looked out my window. I saw a light moving like a lantern."
"Around 11, maybe later." Cray's brows lifted.
"And you're sure it wasn't one of the dog walkers?"
The boy shook his head. "No, sir. The walk was long over. Everyone had gone home. It was just that one light."
"And then it went out." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened.
"Did it go out suddenly," she asked, "or fade?" The boy thought. "Suddenly, Mum. Like someone blew on it." "Thank you," she said gently, and he ran off, relieved to have done his part. They followed the boy's description down the narrow lane to the river path. The snow lay thicker here, muffling every sound except the faint crack of ice shifting on the water. The footprints appeared again, deep, then shallow, as though made hours apart. Cray crouched to inspect them. Strange. These ones faced the opposite way. Miss Marple took a slow step forward, testing how her own boot pressed into the crusted snow. "Snow tells stories in layers, Inspector," she said. "This one's had time to freeze and settle before another passed over it. Someone came this way twice, once before the river froze, once after." Cray stood, brushing snow from his gloves. "You mean they returned after the murder?"
"I suspect so," she replied, looking toward the dark line of the riverbank.
"To tidy what couldn't easily be explained." The inspector frowned. "Covering tracks, you mean?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Perhaps only their own, perhaps another's. Either way, such tidiness often reveals more than it conceals." For a moment, they stood listening to the water beneath the ice, a low, sighing sound like breathing. Across the field, the church spire gleamed faintly under the waning light. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. "Do you think the boy saw the killer?" Cray asked.
"I think," Miss Marple said, "he saw the truth's shadow."
And shadows, like footprints, only show themselves when there's light. As they turned back toward the village, snowflakes began to drift again, soft and soundless. The earlier prints blurred almost at once, dissolving into whiteness. But Miss Marple's mind was already tracing them anew, seeing not just where they led, but when.
Every trail, she thought, leads somewhere.
Even when it's meant to disappear. The snow had begun to fall again, light as dust and silent as thought, when Miss Marple crossed the green toward Mrs. Pennington's cottage. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, and a yellow lamplight trembled behind the lace curtains. The widow had been among the first to speak up that morning, saying she might have seen something, though she'd sounded unsure, almost guilty for even remembering. Miss Marple tapped softly at the door, and after a pause it opened to reveal a woman wrapped in shawls and grief. "Miss Marple?" Mrs. Pennington said, her voice brittle but kind. "I wasn't expecting visitors. I thought you might appreciate some company," Miss Marple replied gently, stepping inside as the widow ushered her to the hearth. The fire hissed low, the scent of pine resin mingling with the faint sweetness of lavender polish. For a moment they sat in companionable quiet, each woman regarding the flames as though searching them for answers. "It's terrible," Mrs. Pennington murmured.
"Poor Martin. Always so polite, always asking after my garden."
"Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "You mentioned this morning that you saw him. Last evening, was it?" The widow nodded, staring into her teacup. "Yes, just before supper. I was closing the curtains when I noticed two figures by the lamp-post across the green, Martin and a woman. They were arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but his hands, well, he waved them about like someone explaining himself. She didn't move much, just stood there listening. Did you recognize her?" Mrs. Pennington hesitated. She had her back to me. "But I remember her coat. It was fur-lined, quite fine, you could tell even in that light. Odd thing is, I can't for the life of me recall the colour. Isn't that strange? You'd think I'd remember something like that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Memory softens more than time does."
"It rounds off the edges that once cut too sharply." The widow gave a sad laugh.
"You make it sound almost merciful." "Sometimes it is," Miss Marple said. "Other times it hides what we need to see." Outside, the wind whispered against the window panes. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes half on the flicker of firelight, half on Mrs. Pennington's trembling hands.
You said they were under the lamp-post, she continued softly.
Was it still lit at the time?
Oh, yes, the widow said.
But the snow was coming down fast then, made halos round the light. And after they walked off toward the lane, I thought I saw someone else further back, near the post office. Just a shape.
I suppose it could have been anyone, Miss Marple nodded, filing the thought.
You've been very helpful, Mrs. Pennington smiled wearily. I've done nothing but talk, I'm afraid. Sometimes talk is the best thing, Miss Marple said, setting her cup down. It keeps the truth from freezing over. As she rose to leave, a soft sound drifted from the neighbouring house, a delicate, tinkling melody, faint but distinct.
A music box.
The tune was old, familiar in a way Miss Marple couldn't place. Mrs. Pennington followed her gaze.
That'll be the Hart's place, she said.
Young couple from London. The wife collects those little boxes, wind up things from markets, plays them all day long. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Do they keep a dog?
Oh, yes.
A spaniel, lively creature.
Barks at every passerby, except last night, funnily. I didn't hear a peep from him. Miss Marple paused at the doorway.
That is funny indeed. The widow blinked, unsure whether to ask what she meant, but Miss Marple was already fastening her scarf. Outside, the village lay wrapped in white silence. The lamp-post across the green stood like a sentinel, its light dim beneath falling snow. Somewhere behind her, the music box still played, soft, persistent, and oddly mournful. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, her gloved hand brushing the gatepost. She glanced once more toward the Hart's darkened window. The tune ended with a tiny click, and all was still again. Sometimes, she murmured, the smallest sound opens the loudest secret, and with that, she turned toward the path, her footprints crisp and alone in the deepening snow. Chapter 3. The Music Box Clue. By the following morning, Little Bramble had wrapped itself deeper in winter silence. The fairground on the green stood half buried in snow, stalls huddled under canvas roofs dusted white. Miss Marple made her way through the crisp air, her breath rising in small clouds as she followed the faint notes of a tune that seemed out of place amid the hush, a music box melody. Delicate and haunting, threading through the cold, it came from the dog bakery stall, one of the few that still stood upright after the storm. A young woman knelt behind the counter, wiping snow from trays of neatly wrapped biscuits shaped like stars and bones. Her red mittens were damp, her smile too bright when she noticed Miss Marple. "Good morning," she said, voice cheerful but thin. "We're not quite open yet, but you're welcome to a sample. They're all pet safe, though I can't promise you'll enjoy them yourself." Miss Marple smiled. "I dare say I'll leave the tasting to the dogs. You must be Miss Devine." "That's right, Clara Devine. I run Perfect Treats. You've probably seen me about with my spaniel Waffles." Miss Marple nodded politely. "I have indeed. I heard your music box from across the green. It's a rather pretty tune." Clara froze for a moment, her gloved hand hovering above a tin of biscuits.
"Oh, yes, I suppose it carries, doesn't it? I like to play it when I'm setting up. It keeps me company. Does it now?"
Miss Marple said lightly.
"It reminds me of one my late friend kept."
"She used to say music boxes hold on to the hearts of those who give them." Clara's gaze dropped.
"It was a gift," she murmured.
"From Martin, the poor man."
"I can hardly believe. Well, you know." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly.
Dreadful shock for the whole village. "You were acquainted?" Clara hesitated. "We met at the fair committee meetings. He helped me find a place for my store."
"Always so kind."
"He even painted the label for my biscuit tins. He was very good with a brush, you know." She gave a small, trembling laugh. "I told him he should have gone into sign painting." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple said, studying the tins neatly stacked behind her. One near the edge caught her eye, the same hand-painted style, a smudged edge, just like the lid she'd pocketed at the riverbank. Clara followed her glance and quickly turned the tin aside.
"That one's just a sample. Old stock," she said quickly.
"From before the fair?" Miss Marple nodded as if the matter were trivial, though her mind was turning quietly. "You must have been very fond of Martin to keep his gift so close." Clara's lips tightened. "Fond, yes. But I hadn't seen him for days."
He stopped calling round last week."
"I thought perhaps he'd gone to visit family." Did he often visit you here?
Sometimes.
He'd bring scraps from the bakery for waffles. Said no dog should go hungry in winter. She gave a brittle smile, though her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she wiped the counter again. The scent drifted toward Miss Marple then, faint but unmistakable. Lavender soap, soft and clean, yet oddly lingering in the frosty air. The same scent she'd noticed on the tin she'd found near the body. She tucked the thought away like a pressed flower, quiet but vivid. "May I ask," Miss Marple said gently, "was there anything unusual about Martin of late?"
Anything that worried him?
Clara hesitated, her mittens twisted in her hand. He did seem preoccupied. Said he'd made a promise he shouldn't have.
I thought it was just village gossip. Everyone here has their secrets, don't they?
She tried to smile again, but her eyes were too bright, as though she'd slept poorly. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Secrets have a way of melting through the snow eventually. Clara looked away. I really should finish tidying before customers come." "Of course," said Miss Marple, turning to leave.
"Thank you, my dear."
"And if you ever feel the need to talk, well, you'll find me at the vicarage this afternoon." As Miss Marple walked away, the music box began to play again, the same tune, gentle, looping, a song that seemed to carry memory rather than melody. She paused at the gate and looked back. Clara stood motionless, her head bowed over the open box, the faint glint of tears catching the morning light. "Some gifts sing long after the giver is gone," Miss Marple murmured to herself, and though the village green looked peaceful beneath its snowy hush, she could feel it now, the thin, trembling note of deceit lingering in the air, as fragile and persistent as the tune itself. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled softly, casting small flickers of amber across the china cups laid out neatly on the table. The scent of scones, still warm from the oven,
mingled with the faint aroma of Earl Grey. Outside,
the late afternoon light turned the snow to silver, softening the rooftops and hedgerows into shapes of quiet calm. Inspector Cray sat stiffly on the edge of an armchair, his hat resting on his knees. Miss Marple's niece, young Ruth, perched beside the window, her cheeks flushed from the cold and curiosity alike. "I do appreciate the invitation," Cray said, eyeing the teapot, as though unsure whether to treat it as evidence or hospitality. "Though I must admit, Miss Marple, I've never solved a case over currant scones before." "Ah," she said with a smile, pouring his tea, "that's where you're mistaken."
"Tea is where most mysteries are solved, Inspector, just not the ones in your reports," Ruth giggled. "Aunt Jane always says no secret can survive a hot kettle," Cray chuckled good-naturedly.
"Well, I suppose you've a point there."
"Now then, you mentioned earlier, what was it? A dog tin?"
"Yes," said Miss Marple, stirring her cup thoughtfully. "An ordinary biscuit tin, half buried near where the poor man was found. It struck me as curious. The lid was hand-painted, quite distinctive, actually." Cray nodded. "We saw the same type at the fair. Belonged to that young woman, Miss Devine. Nothing to suggest foul play, though. People drop things in the snow all the time." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Indeed, but people rarely bury things unless they wish them hidden." The inspector raised an eyebrow.
You think something was concealed inside?"
"I think," she replied, "it's rather too neat a coincidence to ignore. The tin was placed deliberately.
Not tossed or
It might have held something of value, or something someone wished never to be found." Ruth leaned forward, eyes wide. "Martin used to talk about that, you know. Said he'd found a treasure once on one of his walks."
"I thought he was Cray.
"Treasure?
What sort?"
"Oh, he never said exactly," Ruth said. "Only that it wasn't gold or jewels, but it was worth more than either if you knew what it meant. I remember because he winked afterward." Miss Marple's spoon paused in mid-stir. "How intriguing. Did he say where he found it?" "By the old mill, I think," Ruth answered. "He'd been taking the dogs there after dark, said it was peaceful."
"Aunt Jane, do you think that's where he was headed that night?"
Cray shook his head. "We've checked the mill grounds. Nothing there but snow and a few stray prints. Still, I'll have another look if it puts your mind at ease." "It may put your case at ease too," Miss Marple said lightly. "Sometimes what we overlook in daylight shouts quite loudly in the dusk." The inspector gave a small grunt, half amused, half resigned. "You do have a knack for these things, Miss Marple." I suppose I'd better start listening before you solve this without me. She smiled faintly.
I wouldn't dream of depriving you of the satisfaction, Inspector. Outside, a sharp bark broke the calm.
All three turned toward the window. Across the snow-covered street, a dog stood by the edge of the path, nose pointed toward the shadowy outline of the old mill house in the distance. Its body was tense, tail rigid, as though it had caught a scent no one else could sense. Strange, Ruth murmured. That's Waffles, Miss Devine's dog. Perhaps he's only restless, Cray said. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered. The barking grew sharper, echoing across the white fields. Somewhere beyond that quiet stretch of snow, she felt something stirring, something waiting to be uncovered. She reached calmly for her teacup. Even the dogs, she said softly, seem to know when secrets stir. Chapter 4. Echoes at the Mill House. The next morning broke pale and hushed with snow, still drifting from the sky in thin, windless flurries. Miss Marple and Inspector Cray made their way toward the old mill, boots crunching softly on the narrow lane. The building loomed ahead, its wooden wheel frozen mid-turn, the pond beside it layered in glassy ice. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The world around it seemed to hold its breath. Cray fumbled with a heavy iron key. "We've sealed it since the night we found him," he said, unlocking the door. "Nothing's been touched." "Best tread carefully," Miss Marple nodded, stepping inside first. The air met them with a chill of damp wood and old stone, faintly scented with peppermint. The mill house had a melancholy air, half cottage, half workshop, all shadow. Frost traced the corners of the window panes. Beside the hearth sat a single chair, the seat slightly askew, as if someone had risen in a hurry. "Curious smell," Miss Marple murmured, glancing around. "Peppermint oil, I'd say."
"Often used to mask something stronger," Cray said.
"You think he was hiding something?" She smiled faintly. "I think people choose scents the way they choose words, sometimes for honesty, sometimes for disguise." On the far wall stood a small desk cluttered with paper, books, and an overturned inkwell. Cray straightened a folded sheet, its edge stained with a blot of black. "Looks like a letter," he said, squinting. "Addressed to C.D., Clara Devine," Miss Marple said quietly. He read aloud the unfinished lines. "Meet me by the river. Midnight."
"Bring the—" Then the ink trailed off, a thin, frozen streak. Miss Marple traced the edge of the page with a gloved finger. No sign of a struggle, but he left in haste. "A meeting at midnight, yet no sign she ever arrived," Cray sighed.
"Or she did, and left him there. Still, we've nothing to tie her directly." Miss Marple drifted toward the hearth, her eyes narrowing slightly. The ash had cooled, but faint marks patterned the floor, tiny impressions in the dusting of soot and melted snow. She crouched, examining them closely. "Inspector," she said softly, "do come here." He bent beside her. "Footprints?" "Yes, but not human." She pointed with her gloved hand. "See how the prints taper at the edges? Small pads close together."
"A dog's, but not one I recognize."
"Far too small for Waffles or any of the village hounds." Cray frowned.
"Could have been a stray. In Little Bramble?"
she asked, her tone light but knowing. "Strays here are rarer than secrets." "Someone brought this animal inside," Cray straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, so he met someone that night, maybe Clara, maybe another. They brought a dog. Doesn't prove murder." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it does prove familiarity. You don't bring a dog into a stranger's home at midnight." Her gaze wandered to the mantel, where a small framed photograph leaned against the wall. A younger Martin, smiling faintly beside an older woman holding a small white terrier. A faint note had been scrawled on the frame. "For luck, perhaps not a stray," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps a memory." Cray followed her eyes.
"His mother's dog."
"Died years ago, they said." She touched the frame gently, brushing away a trace of dust. "And yet the prints are fresh."
"How strange that a dead dog should walk again." Cray looked uneasy.
"You think someone's using the animal to mislead us?" "Or remind us," she said softly. "Sometimes the footprints that matter most aren't human." A gust of wind sighed through the cracks in the boards, stirring loose flakes of ash. Outside, the mill pond groaned under the weight of ice, echoing faintly like a heartbeat beneath frozen glass. Miss Marple stood still, listening, her thoughts weaving through silence and snow. "There's something here, Inspector," she said finally. "Something left behind that wants to be found." He glanced toward the desk again. "The letter? Perhaps. Or perhaps the story it was too late to finish." As they stepped back into the brittle morning air, Miss Marple looked once more at the frozen wheel. It had not turned in years, yet somehow she felt it would again. Slowly, inevitably, when the thaw came and secrets rose with the river. The sky had dimmed by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Cray reached the riverbank again. Snow fell in gentle curtains, muting every sound except the distant creak of the mill wheel and the crunch of their boots along the frozen path. The river moved sluggishly beneath a crust of ice, whispering faintly beneath its frosted skin. "This was where the footprints ended," Cray said, gesturing toward the bend. "Right before the current," Miss Marple nodded, her gaze sweeping over the white expanse. "It's strange how snow remembers what we forget. It keeps its stories quiet, but not forever." They walked in silence for a while, tracing the uneven impressions in the snow. Then, beneath the arch of the small stone bridge, something caught the light, a dull glimmer against the pale ground. "Hold on," said Cray, crouching down. "Looks like
A lantern."
Half buried under the snow was a small brass lantern, its glass cracked, the handle bent from a fall. Cray lifted it carefully, brushing frost from its side. "Must have been Martin's. Matches the one in his shed." Miss Marple reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, touching the wick inside. The faint scent rose instantly, sweet, floral, familiar. "Lavender," she said softly. "And something else, oil, of course. But this wax, look here, Inspector." He leaned closer, squinting in the failing light. "Lavender wax, you think?" "Yes, homemade by the look of it. See how the residue clings to the edge, unevenly poured."
"I saw the same kind this morning in Miss Devine's bakery stall." Cray exhaled, a puff of mist rising from his lips.
"So she made the candles that fueled this lantern. Still doesn't prove she was here." "No," Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "But it suggests the night wasn't quite as solitary as we assumed." The snow thickened, flakes spinning like ash in the breeze. The river murmured on, dark beneath its fragile crust. Miss Marple took a few slow steps toward the bank, studying the shadows beneath the bridge. "Look here," she murmured.
"Something's been dragged lightly."
"A rope, perhaps."
"Or a leash." Cray crouched again, following her gaze. "You think he met someone here?" "I think," she said, "that he kept his word and came at midnight."
"The question is, did the other party come with a lantern or without one?" Cray frowned, glancing back toward the mill. "We found no second light." "Then either theirs went out," she said, "or they didn't need one because they already knew the way." For a moment, only the whisper of the river answered. Cray turned the lantern over in his hands again, as though hoping it might offer confession. "You know, Miss Marple," he said finally, "I may have to start believing your theories. That lavender trail of yours seems to be winding tighter." She smiled faintly. "It isn't theory, Inspector. It's habit. People tend to carry themselves in their scents, their gestures, their silences."
"Lavender means calm, someone trying very hard to seem composed," he chuckled.
"And who in this village isn't pretending to be calm right now?" "Precisely," she said, brushing snow from her coat. "That's why it's so difficult to see what's right before us." As they turned to leave, Miss Marple paused, her gaze drawn across the river. The faint outline of a cottage stood beyond the trees, its windows dim but one faint lamp glowing behind lace curtains. "That would be Mrs. Pennington's house," Cray said. "Lives alone. Keeps herself to herself." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the soft light flickering behind the glass. "Yes, alone," she repeated thoughtfully. "But not always, I think." The snow began to fall harder, settling over footprints, over the lantern, over everything that might once have told a clearer story. Cray started back up the path, but Miss Marple remained a moment longer, watching the river twist under ice, the world around her wrapped in silence. "Every clue," she whispered, "shines brighter when you stop looking straight at it." Chapter 5. The confession that wasn't. Snow pressed softly against the windows of the constable's office, blurring the view of the green outside. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of coal and damp wool. Clara Devine sat at the small wooden table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, red mittens now gone, leaving pale fingers that trembled slightly. Across from her, Inspector Cray leaned back in his chair, the posture of a man who wanted to appear calm, but had too many questions, still unsatisfied. Miss Marple sat quietly to one side, knitting needles resting idly in her hands. She had not come as an official witness, just an observer, as she often was, but she watched Clara with the gentleness of someone reading a letter they already knew by heart. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Clara said softly, eyes fixed on the tabletop.
"I met Martin that night, yes, by the river."
"But it wasn't what you think. I went there to tell him it had to end." "And what exactly?" Cray asked, voice steady but sharp. "Our understanding," she replied after a pause. "We weren't
engaged, not properly, but there had been something.
He was kind to me when I first arrived here, helped me find the cottage, the stall, even lent me a few pounds when I was short."
"But lately," her voice faltered.
"Lately he'd changed. He said he knew something about me." "Something from before?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Before Little Bramble, you mean?" Clara nodded, her throat working as though swallowing words she'd rather not speak.
"I wasn't always Clara Devine," she whispered.
"Back in London I worked under another name."
"I wasn't proud of it. A job in one of those private clubs. Clean work, mostly. But the kind people here wouldn't understand. I left it behind, came here to start again." Cray leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And Martin knew?"
"He found out somehow."
"I never told him."
"He said he'd seen a photograph years ago when he worked in London himself. Said he'd recognize my face. He thought it gave him power over me." She looked up then, her eyes wet but steady. "He wasn't a bad man, not really. Just lonely."
"He wanted more from me than I could give. So you met to end it," Cray said. "And he threatened you?" Clara hesitated.
"He said if I didn't see him again he might tell others. He even mentioned Ruth, your niece, Miss Marple, said she admired me, and it would be a shame if the village stopped buying from me." Her hands tightened in her lap.
"I told him I was done living in fear. I said what I had to, then I walked away."
"He was alive when I left him."
"I swear it." Silence filled the room.
Only the faint ticking of the constable's clock marked the passage of time. Cray finally spoke. "You expect us to believe that you left him at the river, alive, and someone else just happened along?"
"I don't expect anything," she said quietly.
"Only that you see I'm telling the truth." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "You seemed quite certain he meant to tell someone, yet no letter or message of that sort was found."
"Only the one he began to you." Clara looked startled.
"A letter?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "In his mill house." It ended mid-sentence. "Meet me by the river, midnight." "You say you left him there alive, yet no one else admits to seeing him afterward." Clara's composure cracked then. Tears welled and fell, quick and soundless. "I didn't kill him."
"I couldn't. I just wanted to be free of the past." Miss Marple studied her face with quiet patience.
"There was truth there, yes, but truth, trembling, fragile, half afraid to stand on its own." Cray sighed, standing. "Miss Devine, I'll have to ask you to come with me for formal questioning. It's just procedure, you understand?" Clara nodded weakly, reaching for her coat. "I understand. I suppose one way or another my past has caught me." As she was led toward the door, Miss Marple watched, her expression unreadable. She could feel the sincerity in Clara's voice, the sorrow, the weariness, but also something else beneath it, a small note of hesitation, fear perhaps, or guilt, not of murder, but of knowing more than she dared to tell. "When truth trembles," Miss Marple murmured under her breath. "Innocence sounds very much like guilt." The fire at the Jolly Mug burned low, throwing soft gold light over the dark beams, and the sleepy crowd gathered around the bar. Outside, snow fell in feathery silence, settling thick upon the thatched roofs of Little Bramble. It was the kind of night that made the village seem wrapped in its own dream. Miss Marple sat near the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, listening absently to the crackle of the logs. Inspector Cray had just left to write his report. Clara Devine was being questioned at the station. For the first time that day, quiet had returned, until the door burst open. A gust of snow swept in, followed by a tall man in a long brown coat and travel-worn scarf. His presence broke the hush like a dropped plate. The innkeeper, Mrs. Weaver, looked up from polishing glasses. "Evening, sir," she said, blinking in surprise. "Bit late for travellers." The man stamped snow from his boots and smiled faintly.
"I was told there's a room here."
"Name's Douglas Wells. I've come on family business." Miss Marple's gaze lifted. Family business. Those words always carried weight in small villages. The stranger set down a battered valise, its corners frayed, the leather darkened by years of use. "I'm looking for my brother," he continued. "Martin Wells, he lived at the mill house." A faint stir passed through the room. Mrs. Weaver's hand paused mid-polish. "Then you've come too late, I'm afraid."
"Martin's gone?" The man's expression froze just for an instant.
"Gone? Found by the river 2 nights ago," she said gently. "Constable's looking into it." He sank into the nearest chair, jaw tight.
"I see." Miss Marple watched in silence.
His reaction was curious, not the outburst of grief she'd expected, but a sort of measured shock, as though he were calculating something behind his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mrs. Weaver added softly. He nodded absently, eyes flicking toward the fire. "I was hoping he'd kept something for me."
"An envelope?"
"He wrote about it weeks ago, a matter of inheritance. Said it was important." The inn grew quiet again. Even the clink of mugs seemed to hush. Miss Marple set down her teacup and spoke for the first time. How thoughtful of him to write.
"And yet you've come only now?"
He turned to her, surprised by the gentle question. "The letter only reached me yesterday in Gloucester. I came as quick as I could." Her blue eyes twinkled mildly. "Indeed, though I believe the last post was interrupted by snow for nearly a week." "You must have excellent timing." He hesitated, his smile too quick, too practiced. "Yes, well, I managed." His voice carried a faint accent, northern perhaps, but it slipped at the edges, revealing something softer, less certain. And his boots, Miss Marple noticed as he shifted near the fire, muddy, with a peculiar reddish tint, like the clay that lined the river bank. Mrs. Weaver busied herself finding a key. "We've one room left, the attic, if you don't mind the cold." "Not at all," he said, relief flickering briefly. "Just somewhere to rest. I'll see the constable tomorrow." As he turned, his gaze met Miss Marple's. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he gave a polite nod, the kind meant to dismiss a stranger. She smiled kindly in return. "Welcome to Little Bramble, Mr. Wells. I do hope your stay will be
enlightening." He hesitated again before following Mrs. Weaver upstairs, the old floorboards groaning beneath his boots. When the door shut behind them, Miss Marple remained by the fire, eyes thoughtful.
She reached into her handbag for her notebook and, with neat precision, wrote a single line. Boot size, same as prints by river.
Accent uncertain.
Arrived too soon to have known of death unless he already did. The fire popped softly, sending a thin trail of sparks into the chimney. "Sometimes," she murmured to herself, "the dead aren't the only ones hiding who they are." Chapter 6. The Letter and the Lie. The following morning broke pale and silent, the kind of English winter dawn that turned the snow into silver and the chimneys into soft columns of mist. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tightly as she walked toward the old mill, her breath rising in faint clouds. The constables had cleared the place the night before, leaving behind the sort of tidy disarray that only official hands could produce. Inside, the hearth was cold, but the faint scent of peppermint lingered, the same she had noticed days earlier. On the desk lay Martin's unfinished letter, half hidden beneath a blotter. She'd seen it before, but something about it had nagged at her during the night. The ink had looked heavier, as though it concealed more than it said. From her handbag, Miss Marple produced a small brass warming lamp, a gift from her late nephew who had once fancied himself an inventor. She lit it carefully, its flame glowing with soft amber light, and held the parchment above it. Slowly, faint words began to appear beneath the visible line. written in paler ink, almost invisible until warmed. Her brows lifted slightly as she read, "They must never know about the dog." For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of the lamp. The dog. What secret could possibly be tied to a dog, unless it wasn't an animal at all? She turned the letter over, tracing the edge where the ink had soaked through. Martin had been cautious. The hidden message suggested fear, not guilt. Her mind turned to the dog biscuit tin. Ordinary to the untrained eye, but hand-painted, with enough space to hide a note, or perhaps something smaller and more valuable. Martin had used it for something more than treats. Extinguishing the lamp, Miss Marple pocketed the letter and stepped outside. The air bit at her cheeks, sharp with frost. She followed the lane towards St. Mary's Church, where the vicar, Reverend Hale, was arranging greenery along the railings for the Christmas service. "Good morning, Reverend," she called gently. He straightened, brushing snow from his sleeves.
"Ah, Miss Marple."
"Braving the chill, I see. What brings you out so early?"
"I was hoping to trouble you with a small question," she said, smiling faintly.
"I understand the church has been collecting donations this month for those less fortunate and their four-legged friends." The vicar chuckled.
"Yes, indeed."
"Quite a few tins of dog food, though most have already been distributed. Why do you ask?" "I wondered if you recall who brought them in," she said, feigning casual interest. "It might sound peculiar, but one tin in particular caught my attention."
"Hand-painted with a lavender motif." He furrowed his brow, thinking.
"Now that you mention it, yes, I do recall such a tin. Very distinctive work. It was brought in last week by Mrs. Pennington, the widow who lives opposite the Green. Said her late husband had been fond of painting things in his spare time, and she thought the shelter dogs might enjoy the treats inside." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Very thoughtful of her." "Yes, though she seemed in a hurry that day," the vicar added, adjusting a sprig of holly. "Didn't stop for tea, as she usually does. I remember because she dropped her gloves on the way out." Miss Marple's mind began to thread the details together. The widow's glimpse of Martin with a woman, her nervous demeanour, the music box next door. A pattern was forming, delicate but definite. "Reverend," she asked gently, "do you happen to know if Mrs. Pennington keeps a dog?" He looked puzzled. "A dog? No, I don't believe she does."
"Not since her husband passed." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly.
"Oh, I was merely curious. The letter mentioned one, and I thought perhaps—" She let the sentence trail off, offering a benign shrug. "Memory can play tricks in this weather." The vicar laughed softly. "Indeed it can. You'll stay for a cup of tea before heading back. Another time, perhaps? I have a bit of thinking to do while the clues are still warm." As she walked back through the snow-laden lane, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled like the flakes around her. The widow had no dog, yet she had donated dog food. The biscuit tin had once been Martin's, and the hidden line in the letter suggested something, or someone, was being protected. At the gate to her cottage, she paused and looked back toward the mill, the chimney faint in the morning haze. "Even ink whispers," she murmured to herself, "when you listen closely enough." The churchyard lay wrapped in a hush, so deep it seemed to belong to another world. The moon hung low, a pale coin against a quilt of drifting clouds, and the air carried that sharp, metallic scent that comes only before more snow. Miss Marple stood beside an old yew tree, its trunk dark and rough beneath her gloved hand. She had not told Inspector Cray of her plans. Some truths, she thought, needed to unfold in silence. Frost glittered on the iron gate at the back of the churchyard, the one that opened toward the vicar's garden and the narrow lane beyond. Miss Marple waited, still as stone, her breath misting faintly. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the half-hour. Then she saw it, a small, wavering light moving along the far hedge.
A lantern held low.
The figure carrying it moved slowly, careful with every step. Miss Marple recognized the familiar stoop, the fur-lined coat. Mrs. Pennington. The widow's boots crunched softly in the snow as she reached the back gate. She glanced over her shoulder once, then knelt beside the old rose bush that had long since surrendered to winter. From her coat pocket she drew a small spade, its metal glinting in the moonlight. Miss Marple remained where she was, watching as the widow brushed away a thin crust of snow and began to dig. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a kind of weary dread. After a moment the spade struck metal with a muted clang. The widow gasped softly and cleared the remaining snow. There, half buried beneath the roots, was the biscuit tin, the same one Miss Marple had seen days ago, its hand-painted lavender motif dulled by frost. "Let me help you with that, Mrs. Pennington," came Miss Marple's voice. Calm but firm, the widow started, dropping the spade.
"Oh, good heavens, Miss Marple, you frightened me half to death." "I do beg your pardon," she said gently, stepping forward.
"It's bitterly cold to be out alone at this hour." Mrs. Pennington's face, pale in the lantern light, crumpled.
"I didn't mean any harm," she whispered, voice cat.
"I only needed to move it before someone else found it." Miss Marple bent slightly, brushing her gloved hand over the tin. "War bonds, I believe." The widow's eyes widened, filling with tears. "Yes, my husband bought them during the war. He never told anyone, not even the bank. He meant them to be a safeguard for me in case the pension failed." She sank to her knees, clutching the tin as though it were a living thing. "When Martin discovered them, he said he'd tell the authorities unless I paid him for his silence."
"I couldn't bear the scandal, Miss Marple."
"I've kept this secret for 20 years.
I thought
hiding it again would keep the peace." Miss Marple's expression softened.
"And so you did," she said quietly.
"Until he found your peace worth more than his conscience." The widow sobbed once, a small, broken sound.
"I never wanted him dead. I only wanted to be left alone."
He promised he'd come back for the tin the next night, but when he didn't, Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her shoulder.
"You needn't say more."
"The truth often carries enough sorrow without our adding to it." They stood there for a long moment, the lantern light flickering between them, shadows shifting across the snow. At last, Miss Marple said softly, "You shall give this to Inspector Cray in the morning.
"Tell him exactly what you told me."
He will see the difference between desperation and deceit." Mrs. Pennington nodded weakly, clutching the tin to her chest. "You truly think he'll understand?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He's a good man, though sometimes his spectacles fog with the cold. I shall make sure he sees clearly." As they left the churchyard, snow began to fall again, lightly, gently, as though the night itself wished to cover the pane beneath a softer white. Miss Marple glanced once over her shoulder at the disturbed patch of earth. "Not every thief wants money," she murmured to herself. "Some only want quiet." Chapter 7. Justice in the Snow. The morning after the long, cold vigil in the churchyard dawned pale and silent. Snow fell in small, drifting flakes that softened every edge of the village, the hedgerows, the rooftops, even the church spire, as though little Bramble were being forgiven in white. Miss Marple arrived at the constabulary just as the widow, wrapped in her heavy coat and veiled hat, was being shown into Inspector Cray's office. Inside, the room smelled faintly of ink and pipe smoke. Cray looked tired, his uniform rumpled, his brow shadowed by a sleepless night. Miss Marple stood by the window, hands folded neatly around her handbag, while Mrs. Pennington sat opposite the desk, the biscuit tin resting like an unspoken confession between them. "I'll tell it plain," the widow began, her voice trembling but steady. "Martin came to my cottage that night. He said he wanted more time to decide what to do, whether to sell the bonds or use them to buy silence, as he put it.
I begged him to leave me be," Cray nodded curtly. "And then?"
Mrs. Pennington drew a deep breath. "We walked toward the river. I carried the tin, hoping to convince him I'd hand it over if he promised never to speak of it again. But he laughed, said secrets are worth more than honesty in a place like this." Her gloved hands twisted in her lap. He stepped back, angry, shouting that he'd tell everyone.
"And then?"
Her voice faltered. The silence in the room stretched long. Miss Marple said softly, "Go on, dear." He slipped. The widow whispered. The path by the holly bend was frozen. He fell backward and struck his head on a stone.
I didn't mean for it to happen."
But when he didn't move, she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. I panicked.
"I thought no one would believe me."
So I dragged him off the path and covered him with branches. "I'm not proud of it." Cray leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "And then you hid the tin again?" She nodded. tears glistening beneath the veil.
I couldn't destroy what my husband left.
I only wanted to keep his memories safe. The inspector glanced at Miss Marple, who met his gaze calmly. Well, he said finally, rubbing his chin, her story matches the injury pattern. The blow was blunt, not deliberate.
Accidental by the look of it. Miss Marple remained quiet watching the widow's trembling hand.
Accidents can still leave footprints of intent, she said softly. Though I don't believe Mrs. Pennington pushed him, there's something that doesn't quite fit. Cray frowned.
Such as?
The footprints we found by the river, she replied. There were 2 sets that night. One belonged to Martin, the other, smaller, and not the widow's. She wears square-heeled boots, and the marks by the holly were narrow. Lighter, almost careful. Cray sighed. You're suggesting someone else was there after she left? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Or before she went home. The widow looked up, alarmed.
No, I was alone. I swear it, unless...
She hesitated, fingers tightening around the tin. Unless someone followed us? Cray's expression hardened. You're certain? She shook her head slowly. I don't know. It was dark. I only remember hearing a rustle behind the hedge when I ran. Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. Rustle or not, it seems we have a witness we didn't know existed. Perhaps one who had more to gain than poor Mrs. Pennington. Cray exhaled, staring down at the table. And I suppose you already have someone in mind. She gave him a mild look. I'm afraid I do. But I rather think you do as well. The inspector turned toward the frosted window. Outside, the snow fell in delicate veils, blurring the outline of the inn across the green, the same inn where the so-called brother of Martin Wells had taken his lodging. Cray's jaw tightened.
He's not who he says he is he?
Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet satisfaction. No, Inspector. And if I'm not mistaken, his timing, like his story, was just a little too perfect. The widow wept softly, her confession spent, her conscience lighter for it. Miss Marple leaned toward her, speaking kindly. Take heart, my dear. Truth, when told at last, is never wasted. But sometimes it is only the beginning of what must be uncovered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering even the path to the mill house in a clean, unbroken white. Confessions end the story, Miss Marple murmured to herself, unless they don't. By late afternoon, the snow had stopped, leaving the village washed in stillness, a white calm before revelation. The constabulary was quieter now, the air filled only with the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Cray's desk, the red scarf laid out before them like a patient awaiting diagnosis. Its wool, once bright, had dulled from frost, yet one thing remained clear, the knot. It wasn't a common tie, she said, her voice gentle but certain. You see how it loops twice, crosses under, and then tucks through itself neatly? That's a fisherman's loop, Inspector. Designed to tighten under strain but never slip. Cray leaned forward, studying it.
You think the widow couldn't have tied that?
Miss Marple shook her head. She's arthritic in both hands. I doubt she could have managed such precision on a freezing night. Besides, she told us she never touched his scarf. No, this knot belongs to someone accustomed to ropes or nets. Cray's brow furrowed. Like a sailor. Precisely. The inspector rose, pacing slowly.
You're thinking of the brother, aren't you?
Douglas Wells claimed to have come from the coast near Bristol. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A convincing claim, except for the boots. River clay, not seaside sand.
And the laces. See how they're frayed at the end?
He tied them the same way, 2 loops, double-crossed.
Habit reveals more than words, Cray's up.
So he came back to finish what his brother started, or to take what his brother failed to steal, Miss Marple said softly. The war bonds, a sharp knock interrupted them. Constable Finch entered, breath misting in the cold. So the lodger from the inn, he's gone. Room empty. Window open. Tracks lead toward the pond. Cray snatched his coat from the stand.
Come on, then.
But Miss Marple only straightened her hat. No need to rush, Inspector. He'll not get far. The snow may forgive, but it doesn't forget. They followed the trail out of the village, the inspector's boots crunching heavily, hers light and deliberate. The footprints wound past the green, over the bridge, and down toward the frozen pond, where reeds shivered like thin glass. The moon, still pale from afternoon light, hovered behind thin clouds, casting a ghostly glow across the ice. "There," Cray said, pointing. "He slipped through the hedgerow." Miss Marple stopped, raising a hand.
"Wait, look at the prints," he frowned.
"What about them?"
"They double back," she said quietly.
The right foot dragged slightly, as if burdened.
"He's carrying something." They rounded the curve by the pond, just as a shape emerged ahead. A tall figure hunched beneath his coat, the red scarf clutched in one gloved hand.
The man froze when he saw them, eyes darting like a trapped fox. "Douglas Wells," Cray shouted.
"Stop where you are!"
But the stranger turned and bolted across the frozen pond. His boots hammered the ice, sending hollow cracks echoing into the still air. Cray began to follow, but Miss Marple called sharply, "No, Inspector!"
"Let him run."
"The ice won't hold two." The man's pace faltered near the centre, the scarf trailing behind him like a red streak against the white. Then, with a terrible sound, a brittle crack, the ice gave way. He plunged forward, vanishing into the dark water beneath. For a long, breathless moment, there was nothing. Then a single glove floated to the surface, drifting toward the reeds. Cray exhaled heavily, shoulders sinking. "Well, that's that then." Miss Marple's eyes were calm, though touched with sadness. "Justice doesn't always shout, Inspector. Sometimes it simply sighs." They stood in silence, watching snow begin to fall again, light, steady, erasing footprints one by one. At last, she spoke softly. The truth has a way of circling back, like footprints in fresh snow. Chapter 8. A Toast to the Season. Christmas morning arrived like a soft breath over Little Bramble. Fresh, rosy light spilling across snow-covered rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys, and the faint peal of church bells drifting through the crisp air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world made new. Every window glowed with candlelight, every doorstep brushed clean, as if the village itself wished to begin again. Inside the jolly mug, the heart of the village pulsed with laughter and warmth. Mrs. Weaver had strung evergreen garlands across the beams, their scent mingling with the crackle of the hearth and the sweet aroma of cinnamon buns. Villagers gathered close together, coats unbuttoned, mittens steaming beside mugs of tea. The clatter of spoons and cheerful chatter rose and fell like a familiar song. Miss Marple sat near the window as she so often did, her knitting bag resting at her side, and a faint smile playing about her lips. The events of the past week felt distant now, like a shadow fading from memory. The case had ended not with triumph, but with understanding, and she was content with that. Truth, she thought, was a fragile thing, too brittle to be forced, too valuable to be ignored.
Maggie, her cheerful niece, came bustling over with flushed cheeks and a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "A little something, Aunt Jane. You've earned it after all that dreadful business." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "My dear, the only thing I've earned is another cup of tea." "Humour me," Maggie said, placing the parcel in her hand.
Inside was a hand-painted mug, cream-coloured with delicate gold letters along the rim. "Thank you." A cluster of holly leaves curved around the base, their berries bright and merry. "Oh, how lovely," Miss Marple murmured, running a gloved finger over the painted glaze. "You've quite outdone yourself." "It was Maggie's idea," Mrs. Weaver called from behind the counter. "She said you deserved something special for putting our minds at rest." Before Miss Marple could reply, the door swung open, and a familiar voice greeted the room. "Merry Christmas to you all." Inspector Cray stepped in, brushing snow from his coat, his usually stern face softened by a rare smile. The villagers cheered good-naturedly, ushering him toward the fire. Someone pressed a steaming mug of cider into his hand. He spotted Miss Marple and joined her table, easing into the chair opposite. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, raising his mug slightly, "I suppose congratulations are in order. I'm still not sure how you saw what the rest of us missed." She smiled over the rim of her tea. "Oh, I don't see more, Inspector. I simply pay attention to what remains when everything else is brushed away, rather like sweeping snow from a doorstep." He chuckled. "If only logic were as tidy as your metaphors." Still, I'll admit, your patience saved us no small trouble. Patience, she said softly, and a bit of listening. Most puzzles solve themselves if we let people talk long enough. The fire popped behind them, sending a warm glow across the polished floorboards. Outside, children ran laughing across the village green, pulling sleds and tossing handfuls of powdery snow. The church bells chimed again, this time joined by the faint chorus of carolers. Cray leaned back, sighing contentedly. Strange thing, Justice. It never feels quite how one expects. Not like the stories. No, Miss Marple agreed. Real justice is quieter, more a returning of balance than a triumph. He nodded, thoughtful.
And you, Miss Marple?
What will you do now that peace has returned? She smiled, eyes twinkling. Why, have another cup of tea, of course, and perhaps feed the robins. They too deserve a little Christmas breakfast. Cray laughed, shaking his head. You make it sound so simple. It is, she said kindly. Most good things are. The warmth of the fire deepened, the room glowing in golden light as snowflakes began to drift past the window once more. Maggie returned to refill their cups, her laughter bright, her spirit light. Miss Marple raised her new mug, admiring the way the gold letters caught the firelight. Some gifts, she said softly, are poured from the heart. And as she took her sip, the bells outside rang again, clear and hopeful, carrying across the snowy rooftops of Little Bramble, where peace had finally come home. Evening fell softly over Little Bramble, quieting the laughter and bells that had filled the day. The last of the carolers passed beneath Miss Marple's window, their lanterns flickering gold against the snow. Inside her small room at the Jolly Mug, the fire murmured in the grate, its glow wrapping the walls in amber light. A pot of tea sat warming beside her, and in her lap rested a half-finished letter to her dear friend in St. Mary Mead. She dipped her pen into the inkwell and began to write, her script neat and even despite the tremor of age. My dear Dolly, I trust this letter finds you well and that your roses have survived December's frost. You will be pleased to hear that Little Bramble has finally found its peace after quite a troublesome Christmas. Though it was a sad business, it has reminded me how thin the frost of civility can be and how easily human frailty hides beneath it. She paused, watching the fire dance and snap. The shadows along the walls swayed gently, as if nodding in agreement. Even here, among holly and hymn-singing, I found envy, pride, and fear disguised as friendship. It is a curious thing how people may decorate their hearts as they do their homes, bright on the outside, dimmer within. Yet when truth at last is spoken, light returns in the most unexpected corners. Poor Mrs. Fletcher will bear her guilt, I think, but not her shame, and that perhaps is the better punishment. A faint smile touched her lips. She reached for her tea, inhaling its faint aroma of cloves and honey. Outside, snowflakes pressed softly against the glass, blurring the world into a quiet watercolor. Inspector Cray, she continued, proved a most thoughtful companion, though he still trusts reason more than intuition. I suspect in time he will learn that both are needed if one hopes to see clearly through the fog. It pleases me to think that he may yet grow into a fine detective, if only he will learn to listen as much as he observes. Miss Marple set her pen down and looked toward the fire again. Each ember seemed to hold a story, a spark of memory from all the winters that had come before. So many mysteries, she thought, yet all of them bound by the same thread, human nature, the endless, tender, foolish heart. She leaned back in her chair, her knitted shawl drawn close, and spoke softly to the quiet room. It never truly ends, does it? The questions, the kindnesses, the little deceptions. Her smile deepened. But I suppose that is life, and quite right too. Reaching once more for her pen, she finished the letter with slow, graceful strokes. And so, my dear, another Christmas mystery draws to a close. The snow still falls, and somewhere in this little village peace has returned to hearts that nearly lost it. I shall leave tomorrow, though part of me will stay behind, by the firelight, among the laughter, where truth found its home. Every Christmas holds its mysteries, Thankfully, not all end in sorrow. Yours ever, Jane. She sealed the letter carefully and set it beside the lamp, where the wax glimmered like a ruby in the warm light. The fire crackled once more, softer now, the last log sinking into a bed of glowing ash. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter and gazed into the flames, her thoughts as steady as the rhythm of the burning wood. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, veiling the village in white, a hush over every rooftop and gatepost. Every secret forgiven, she closed her eyes, listening to the wind sigh against the window-pane, and murmured almost to herself, "And so ends another story whispered by the winter wind." And so, dear listener, our Christmas tale comes to its gentle close. Snow still drifts outside the jolly mug, soft as memory, wrapping little Bramble in a hush only winter can bring. The village dogs sleep contentedly by the hearth, tails curled, dreams warm. The carols have faded, the lanterns are dim, and all that remains is peace, the kind earned by truth and quiet courage. The fire flickered once more, then settled into peace.